In the heart of a Montana blizzard, a battle-scarred veteran spots a wounded bobcat kitten limping toward the light of his lonely diner. But when he saves her, he uncovers a secret hidden beneath her fur, a secret that ruthless men would kill to protect. In a night where survival is anything but certain, trust becomes the only way out. Have you ever risked everything for something fragile? Tell me where you're watching from, and if this story stirs something in you, like and subscribe for more journeys of hope and courage. Montana's winter pressed down like a steel trap, unforgiving and endless. The wind came in from the mountains, rattling the snow-caked windows of Walker's diner and tugging at the loose sign swinging above the door. Inside, the heater groaned, fighting off the cold as best it could. Only a handful of locals sat scattered among the booths, each lost in their own silent rituals, the quiet only broken by the scrape of cutlery or the distant static of a radio left on too long. Ethan Walker was used to the quiet. At 42, the rhythm of the diner was his anchor. Coffee pots hissing, plates clinking, the slow grind of the morning giving way to the hush of the afternoon. After everything he'd seen and done in another life, out where the sun baked sand into memory and the nights never truly ended, he preferred things simple, predictable, and slow. But nothing about that day was predictable. He was restocking the sugar when he glanced out the front window and caught a movement against the swirling white outside. At first, it was nothing. A shadow, a shape hunched against the frozen world. Then it moved again, emerging from behind a drift, and he realized it was an animal, but not a dog, not a coyote, a bobcat kitten. Ethan had seen wild things before. He'd tracked wolves in Wyoming, startled a bear once out by the dump. But this creature was something else. It was small, barely the size of a house cat, and the winter had not been kind. Its fur stuck out in dirty, frost-bitten tufts, a pale, tawny streak against the snow. One of its back legs dragged behind it, twisted and awkward, and its belly was stained dark, the color of old blood. It was limping toward the light of the diner, drawn by hope or desperation. He couldn't say. For a long moment, Ethan just watched. Outside, the wind howled, and the kitten hesitated, every muscle in its frail body ready to bolt. But the cold was winning, and Ethan could see the shivers rack its tiny frame. He looked around the diner. Nobody else noticed, or if they did, nobody cared. Maybe they'd all seen enough of suffering for one lifetime. He was about to step outside when, through the blowing snow, his eyes caught something else. Just beyond the edge of the lot, a black SUV idled by the highway. The vehicle's windows were tinted, the engine running, exhaust pluming in the cold. For a second, the driver's silhouette moved, as if watching the same kitten. Then, as if by decision, the SUV pulled away, tires spitting slush, vanishing into the white. The unease that Ethan thought he'd left behind in another life stirred, crawling up his spine. Vehicles didn't just wait out there for nothing, especially not in the dead of winter. Ethan shook off the feeling and pushed through the diner door, the cold slapping him awake. The snow was knee-deep, the sky bruised and low. He stepped carefully, hands open, trying not to spook the animal. The kitten bared tiny fangs, a weak snarl rumbling up from its chest. He knelt, lowering himself to eye level, the way he remembered doing with wounded animals long ago. "It's okay, little one," he murmured, voice low, steady. "You're not the only one out here trying to survive." The kitten didn't understand, of course. Its ears flicked back, pupils wide, breath coming in short bursts. But it didn't run. Maybe it couldn't. Ethan inched closer, noting the precision of the wounds on its belly. Thin, clean cuts, too straight for a fight with another animal. There was something surgical about them, deliberate in a way that made his heart thud harder. He took off his flannel jacket and used it as a shield, coaxing the kitten closer. The little creature hissed, batting at him with needle claws, but the fight in it was fading fast. When he finally wrapped the jacket around its frail body, Ethan could feel its ribs under the fur, bones sharp and trembling. Inside the diner, heads turned. Old Tom at the counter shook his head, muttering about strays and fools, but Ethan ignored him. He set the kitten gently on a stack of towels near the heater, inspecting its wounds by the yellow light. Blood matted the fur, and the cuts on its stomach were precise, almost clinical. He'd seen wounds like that before, never on an animal, but plenty on soldiers and civilians in places most people couldn't pronounce. He worked quietly, moving with a steady precision that felt both foreign and familiar. He boiled water, fetched a needle and thread from his first aid kit, cleaned the wounds with shaking hands. The kitten whimpered, biting at the towel, but not at him. Under the harsh light, he noticed something metallic glinting beneath the skin. He'd have to investigate that later. The diner returned to its hush, the storm howling outside, the kitten fighting for every breath inside. Ethan couldn't shake the image of the black SUV, the way it had paused just long enough to matter. Something was wrong in this picture. More than just a wounded wildcat. More than just a cold night. Outside, the world was closing in. Inside, Ethan Walker made a silent promise. As long as this kitten needed him, he wouldn't look away. Not again, not ever. He didn't know it yet, but this night, this choice, would pull him into a storm far more dangerous than winter. By midnight, the diner had emptied, and the wind rattled the doors with a kind of angry persistence that no longer startled Ethan. He locked up, checked twice, then gathered the kitten, still wrapped in his flannel jacket, and trudged through the snow toward his small cabin just behind the diner. The animal barely stirred, its breathing shallow, every motion a careful negotiation with pain. Ethan's boots left deep prints in the snow, a trail of one man and one nearly broken life following behind. The cabin was small but warm, a safe haven that Ethan had built with his own hands over the years, a place where he could hear the storm but never feel its teeth. He set the kitten down on a folded blanket near the wood stove. The animal's fur steamed slightly, wet from melted snow, its eyes half closed in exhaustion. In the glow of the fire, the kitten's injuries looked worse. The belly matted, the surgical cuts glaringly out of place on a wild creature. Ethan's hands moved on their own, guided by old training and instincts drilled into him by necessity rather than kindness. He fetched a clean towel, poured hot water, and laid out his makeshift field kit. His fingers trembled only slightly as he cleaned the wounds, gently teasing out flecks of gravel and grit from the torn skin. Every so often the kitten's body jerked, a stifled mewl of pain, but it never tried to bite or escape. That, more than anything, told him how weak it truly was. As he worked, Ethan noticed something odd beneath the blood and fur, a hard, thin line where the flesh didn't quite move right. Using tweezers, he found a small lump under the skin, almost like a pellet or bead. At first he thought it was just scar tissue, maybe a bullet fragment, but when he pressed, the kitten shuddered violently, and the area glinted with an unnatural shine. Heart pounding, he made a quick decision. With careful, practiced hands, he cut gently into the skin, exposing the foreign object just beneath the surface. It was a metallic capsule, no bigger than a pencil eraser, stitched tightly inside with black thread finer than any fishing line. For a second, he just stared. Then, with a shallow breath, he snipped the thread and eased the capsule out. It was slick with blood, perfectly smooth except for a tiny red light blinking from one end. As Ethan watched, the light flickered twice, then held steady. He didn't need to be a tech genius to understand. Something, somewhere, had just been activated. Maybe a signal sent. Maybe a location marked. A chill ran up his arms, colder than the Montana night outside. Setting the capsule aside, Ethan quickly stitched up the wound, hands moving automatically as his mind spun with possibilities. What kind of person implants a device in a wild bobcat kitten? Who is tracking this animal, and why? The memory of the black SUV flashed in his mind again, and suddenly the cold night felt even more suffocating. When he finished, Ethan gently wiped the kitten's face, now pale and twitching with fever. He found an old cardboard box, lined it with towels, and coaxed the animal inside, placing it near the warmth of the wood stove. The kitten's eyelids fluttered, but it remained awake, stubbornly alert in a way that unsettled him. Most wild cubs, if rescued, would hide under the bed or cower in the darkest corner. This one sat up, ears pricked, gaze fixed on the cabin door, as if listening for footsteps only it could hear. Ethan tried to settle his nerves. He tossed another log onto the fire and double-checked the locks, feeling that old soldier's instinct prickling along his skin. He stood by the window for a long time, scanning the empty lot for headlights, the highway for any sign of that SUV. Nothing but the snow falling harder, the world silent except for the crackle of the flames. Back at the box, the kitten had not moved. Its sides rose and fell with shallow, nervous breaths, and its tiny nose twitched at every creak of the cabin. Ethan watched it, wondering if the animal sensed something beyond what he could. In the old days, when he was deployed overseas, he'd seen dogs and cats do strange things, reacting to distant sounds or hidden dangers before any human could sense them. The kitten's stillness now was less about fear and more about vigilance. Whatever had happened to it before tonight had taught it something Ethan couldn't see. He checked the capsule again, turning it over in his hand. The light glowed faintly, ominously, and the metal felt too heavy for its size. He knew he needed help, someone who understood both animals and technology, someone he could trust not to ask too many questions. A name floated into his mind. Claire Monroe, a wildlife biologist he'd met during a bear incident last fall. She had contacts in state and federal agencies, but more than that, she understood the way danger could find you even out here, in the middle of nowhere. Sleep came in fits and starts that night, every sound outside keeping Ethan on edge. The storm raged, the kitten watched, and the little red light kept blinking, as if counting down to something neither of them could see. Ethan Walker knew one thing for certain. He couldn't turn back now. He had crossed the line, taken responsibility for a life, and possibly stumbled into a secret that others would kill to retrieve. The real storm was just beginning. The Montana sunrise filtered through frosted windows, painting pale orange stripes across the cabin floor. Ethan had barely slept. Each time he closed his eyes, fragments of memory flickered, gunfire echoing in a different desert, the desperate cry of wounded men, the helpless shiver of a small creature relying on his hands. Now, that creature lay in the makeshift bed by the stove, battered but alive, breathing quietly in the warmth. For a fleeting moment, the world seemed almost peaceful. Ethan brewed coffee and moved with the careful silence of someone used to not waking ghosts. He checked the kitten's stitches, noting the swelling was down, the bleeding mostly stopped. The capsule, wrapped in a cloth and hidden in a drawer, pulsed with its eerie red light. Ethan tried not to think about it, focusing instead on practical tasks, feeding the animal small sips of water, cleaning its fur, stacking wood for the stove. Normal things, if anything, could be normal after the previous night. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world hushed and blindingly white. The snowdrifts rose to the windowsills, covering the yard in a thick, glittering blanket. The air tasted clean and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and something colder, something that reminded Ethan of nights spent on the edge of enemy territory, waiting for trouble. At the diner, things picked up as the morning wore on. Locals thawed out with hot coffee and gossip, their voices bouncing around the small space. Ethan moved between tables, pouring refills, all the while keeping half an eye on the highway outside. The night's events replayed over and over in his mind. Every customer felt like a potential threat. Every car on the road a messenger of bad news. He told himself he was being paranoid, that this was just a wounded wild animal, nothing more. But the kitten's wounds and the capsule said otherwise. By noon, word of the storm and the crazy stray cat rescue had spread. Old Tom recounted the tale with fresh exaggeration to anyone who'd listen, painting Ethan as half hero, half fool. Most laughed. A few shook their heads. But behind the laughter, Ethan could feel the tension. Something was different. The air charged with the kind of electricity that signaled a brewing storm, one not caused by weather. It was during the late lunch rush that the peace truly shattered. A pair of strangers arrived in town, their presence announced not with noise but with silence. They were dressed for the cold but too polished, their boots too clean for Montana slush. They moved through the diner with practiced ease, sliding into a booth by the window. Ethan watched as one of them produced a stack of photographs from a battered leather folder, spreading them across the tabletop. Customers tried not to stare, but curiosity won out. A waitress named Becky sidled up to Ethan as he refilled the sugar containers. She leaned in, voice low. "Those two are asking around, showing people pictures of a bobcat cub, said it's got strange scars." Ethan's blood ran cold. He kept his movements calm, every muscle trained to mask tension. "Did they mention why?" he asked quietly, not really expecting an answer. Becky shook her head. "Didn't say, but I saw that black SUV again. Same one from yesterday. It was parked across from the hardware store, just sitting there. The SUV, the capsule, the kitten. It was all connected, a web tightening around his quiet life." Ethan finished his chores with forced normalcy, but inside, everything felt like it was unraveling. He glanced over at the booth. The strangers were speaking softly with a local rancher, showing him the photos, pointing out details. Ethan couldn't see the images, but he could imagine the kitten's twisted leg, the precise surgical wounds, the terror in its wild eyes. After the lunch rush, the strangers moved on, but not before Becky returned, face tight with worry. One of them left a card, said if anyone saw the animal we should call. Offered money, lots of it. Money always changed things in a small town. Secrets were hard to keep. Ethan knew he had to act, and fast. He returned to the cabin, heart pounding, mind racing. The kitten sat upright, ears pricked, eyes following every sound from outside. It wasn't fear, more like readiness, a waiting tension that made the fur along its back ripple. Ethan checked the capsule. still blinking its baleful red light. He considered smashing it, tossing it into the woods, but something told him that wouldn't solve anything. If someone wanted the kitten bad enough to track it, to implant this device, they wouldn't give up now. He made a decision. He would call Claire Monroe, the biologist. She was the only one he trusted with the truth, someone who understood wild things and secrets and the thin line between them. The sun dipped low, sending blue shadows skittering across the snow. Ethan stood at the window, watching for the telltale shape of the SUV. He thought about the strangers' faces, the cold calculation in their eyes. Whatever game he'd stumbled into was bigger than a wounded bobcat. He looked down at the kitten, who met his gaze without flinching. For the first time, Ethan saw not just an injured animal, but a survivor, a creature as trapped as he was, both of them hunted by dangers they could barely understand. Night crept in, and with it came the knowledge. The fight for survival was just beginning, and the stakes had grown higher than he'd ever imagined. The phone call to Claire Monroe was brief, but its urgency hung in the air long after Ethan ended the call. He kept his voice steady, relaying only the essentials: a wounded bobcat kitten with a strange, implanted capsule, and a growing sense that he was being watched. Claire agreed to come by as soon as she could. Her trust was hard-won, and Ethan felt relief knowing he wouldn't be facing this mystery alone. The late afternoon bled into evening. Shadows crept across the snowy yard, stretching toward the diner and Ethan's small cabin like grasping hands. He watched from his window, eyes darting to every unfamiliar shape, heart thrumming in time with each gust of wind. The kitten remained in its box by the stove, its coat drying, belly rising and falling in uneasy rhythm. Every now and then, it would lift its head, ears swiveling, as if picking up signals from a world beyond Ethan's senses. When Claire arrived, the headlights of her old Jeep cut briefly through the dusk before she parked behind the diner, well out of sight from the main road. She was wrapped in a heavy parka, boots caked with old mud, hair tied back in a practical braid. She moved with the assurance of someone used to harsh terrain and unpredictable calls for help. Ethan ushered her inside, and together they hovered over the kitten like field medics on a battlefield. Claire's hands were gentle but unflinching as she examined the animal. She took samples, prodded the wound, and listened intently as Ethan described what he had found and how the capsule had blinked to life the moment it was removed. She asked technical questions, and Ethan answered as best as he could. When Claire finally cracked open the capsule with a specialized tool from her kit, the interior revealed a sliver of circuit board and a tiny data chip, slick with blood, but unmistakable in its design. It wasn't until Claire slipped the chip into a small reader and attached it to her laptop that the true nature of their discovery became clear. Lines of encrypted video files blinked onto the screen, time-stamped, labeled in shorthand that neither of them understood. But a few seconds of shaky footage were enough to raise the hair on Ethan's neck. Shadowy figures speaking in hurried whispers, glimpses of military insignia, flashes of faces that seemed both foreign and eerily familiar. Claire's eyes widened as she clicked through the files. "This isn't wildlife research," she murmured. "Someone is using this animal to smuggle evidence, video evidence." The realization landed with the weight of a falling stone. Ethan's mind raced. Smuggling, espionage, secrets stitched beneath the skin of a half-frozen kitten. He remembered the precision of the cuts, the deliberate placement of the capsule, the black SUV idling like a vulture. The stakes of this quiet drama had just escalated from personal to national. Before they could say more, the distant sound of an engine sent both of them ducking toward the window. Headlights swept the driveway, slow and searching, illuminating the packed snow and the faint tracks Ethan had left earlier. The black SUV had returned, gliding to a halt just beyond the glow of the porch light. For a long moment, no one moved. The engine idled, a beast waiting for its chance. Ethan's old instincts roared to life. He felt the burn of adrenaline, the same sensation that had once kept him alive in places he never spoke about. He grabbed his rifle, motioned for Claire to keep low, and dimmed the lamps. The world outside was silent, save for the steady rumble of the SUV. Ethan's breath steamed in the cold, his body tense as a tripwire. Through the frosted glass, he watched two shapes emerge from the vehicle, one tall and broad, the other smaller, both moving with the efficiency of trained men. Inside the cabin, the kitten tensed, pupils wide, body pressed flat against the towels. Its wild senses picked up danger in a way Ethan could only envy. Claire closed her laptop and stowed it in her backpack, slipping the data chip into a hidden pocket. She glanced at Ethan, her expression tight with the knowledge that this was no longer just about a wounded animal. The first knock on the door was sharp, more command than request. Ethan stayed silent. The second was louder, echoing through the cabin. When no answer came, the strangers tried the doorknob, rattling it with impatience. Ethan kept his finger near the trigger, mind racing through options: fight, hide, run. But then the sound of approaching sirens shattered the tension, distant but unmistakable. For a split second, the strangers hesitated. Then they retreated, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as they'd arrived. Ethan and Claire exchanged glances, a silent agreement forming between them. Staying was no longer an option. They gathered what little they could: Ethan's jacket, Claire's equipment, the frightened kitten bundled in a towel. The sirens faded, but the danger remained. Ethan's PTSD stirred, memories of carrying the wounded under fire flashing behind his eyes. The old training kicked in, every movement measured and deliberate. They left through the back, moving fast but quiet, the snow muffling their footsteps. The wind picked up, a blizzard rolling in, erasing their tracks almost as soon as they made them. Behind them, the SUV's headlights swept the lot one last time, searching. In the near whiteout, Ethan cradled the kitten against his chest, feeling its rapid heartbeat sync with his own. Beside him, Claire led the way, her breath visible in the freezing air. The road ahead vanished into swirling snow. Every step forward was a gamble, but turning back was no longer an option. Just as Ethan thought they might have lost their pursuers, another set of headlights pierced the storm, closer and closing fast. The hunt was on. The blizzard swallowed sound and sight, reducing the world to a narrow tunnel of swirling white. Ethan's boots crunched through crusted snow, each step an act of will against the biting wind. Claire moved just ahead, shoulders hunched, clutching her backpack to her chest as if it contained the very secret of survival. Wrapped inside Ethan's jacket, the kitten trembled, its fragile body pressing close, but those wild, alert eyes never blinked. Every few paces, Ethan checked behind them, seeing nothing but wind-tossed flakes and the occasional flash of headlights, always too close. Their escape became a test of endurance. The storm erased their footprints even as they made them, and in a twisted way, Ethan was grateful. The same snow that threatened to bury them would also cover their trail, buying precious time. Yet the storm was unforgiving, cold slicing through gloves, icy gusts threatening to steal every last scrap of warmth from bone and spirit alike. Each time Ethan's strength faltered, He thought of the strangers' faces, the relentless red blink of the capsule, the kitten's desperate will to survive. Turning back was unthinkable. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the edge of the old timberline, where a cluster of abandoned cabins offered momentary shelter. They ducked into the largest, the walls groaning under the weight of packed snow, the roof sagging but holding. Inside, their breaths filled the air with fog. Claire immediately unzipped her backpack, extracting the capsule and data chip. Her hands shook as she wrapped them in an insulated pouch, tucking it deep into her coat. Ethan's mind raced with the pieces falling into place. Claire spoke quietly, piecing together what they now understood. The chip stored encrypted video, damning evidence of a high-ranking official's secret dealings with a known terrorist group. The capsule was never meant to be found by authorities, nor by a local diner owner and a wildlife biologist. Its accidental rescue had set off a cascade of consequences neither of them could have imagined. Resting for only a few moments, they plotted their next move. Hiding was pointless. The black SUV and its crew would never stop searching. Not now. Claire explained that her contact at the federal courthouse in Helena, a judge with a reputation for integrity, could take custody of the evidence. But reaching the courthouse meant crossing the mountains, risking every hazard nature and man could throw at them. The stakes had shifted. This wasn't about saving a life anymore, but protecting a truth so explosive it could topple careers and save countless lives. Outside, the storm continued its assault. Somewhere beyond the white, engines revved and headlights sliced through the swirling snow. Time was running out. As darkness closed in, Ethan pressed a battered old radio into Claire's hands, instructing her to check in every hour if they got separated. Then, with the kitten nestled between his chest and coat, they slipped from the cabin and into the wild again. The trek was brutal. The snow was deep and uneven, forcing them to zigzag across the landscape, avoiding obvious paths and natural choke points. The air seemed to close around them, heavy with the knowledge that every tree could hide a watcher. Every gust could mask the crunch of a pursuer's boots. Ethan's memories flickered. Nights spent crossing enemy lines. The terror of not knowing if help or harm lay around the next corner. He fought the old panic, pushing forward step by agonizing step. As they trudged onward, the kitten's instincts proved uncanny. Its ears twitched at the faintest sound, and once, when Ethan almost stumbled into a ravine masked by snow, the kitten let out a sharp cry, saving them from a deadly fall. Claire, too, began to rely on the animal's warnings. Its senses seemed attuned not just to the cold, but to the presence of danger, an early alarm that made the difference between life and death more than once. It wasn't long before their worst fears found them. As they skirted the edge of a frozen creek, Claire slipped and tumbled down a shallow slope. Ethan rushed after her, only to see, through the haze, dark shapes fanning out along the ridgeline. Pursuers, unmistakable, moving with trained precision. The lead figure was larger, his silhouette familiar even from a distance. Colton Briggs, an ex-agent turned mercenary, rumored to have gone rogue after a failed operation years before. Ethan remembered his reputation: ruthless, relentless, impossible to bribe or shake. The chase became desperate. Claire clung to the evidence, Ethan to the kitten. They dodged through tangled brush, scrambled over downed logs, half crawling, half running, always a heartbeat ahead of the men closing in. Ethan's mind was clear now. This was no longer a rescue, but a mission. The burden he carried was more than flesh and blood. It was the fragile weight of truth itself. As they paused for breath, Ethan made a decision. There could be no more running without a plan. He whispered the words more to himself than anyone, a soldier's promise forged in heat and fear. They would reach that courthouse, no matter the price. The wind howled, the night pressed in. But somewhere beneath the layers of snow and fear, resolve burned bright. The next steps would be the hardest yet. The mountains of Montana were never forgiving, but on this night they seemed to rise up as an unscalable fortress against Ethan and Claire. The snow fell so thick it blurred the horizon, transforming the landscape into a maze of pale ridges and shadowy valleys. They pressed forward, the wind clawing at their faces, every muscle in Ethan's body burning from cold and fatigue. The kitten, wrapped inside Ethan's jacket, barely made a sound except for the steady rhythm of its heart against his ribs, a fragile drumbeat reminding him of everything at stake. For hours, they moved under cover of darkness, following no path but their own instinct and the faint hope that the storm would keep their pursuers at bay. Claire walked a few steps ahead, her boots crunching with determination, eyes scanning for any sign of danger or shelter. She checked the evidence in her backpack obsessively, the capsule now carefully padded and hidden, as if the mere act of holding it might protect them from the ruthless force behind this hunt. The terrain grew treacherous. Steep, icy slopes forced them to zigzag and climb on hands and knees. Ethan's mind flashed to memories of long-forgotten patrols, jungles and deserts, ruined cities, always moving, always hunted. The same relentless discipline carried him now, guiding each careful footfall, each measured breath. Every so often, the kitten would stir and twitch, ears pricking toward a distant snap of a branch or a rumble buried beneath the howl of the wind. Its instincts were uncannily sharp. More than once, the animal's tension warned them of subtle traps, fresh boot prints just out of sight, a faint metallic glint that marked the edge of a tripwire, the acrid tang of cigarette smoke drifting from a hidden position. With every sign, Ethan's respect for the animal deepened. It was as if the wilderness had given them a silent ally, one whose senses stretched far beyond human limitations. Midway up a narrow ravine, the world suddenly erupted into chaos. A sheet of snow collapsed above them, triggering a miniature avalanche that swept Claire off her feet and nearly buried Ethan to the waist. He clawed his way out, gasping for air, snow burning against his skin, heart pounding as he found Claire, half submerged but alive, her hand still clutching the evidence. The kitten wriggled and cried, sensing danger even as the roar faded. There was no time to recover. Across the canyon, a flare of light and the unmistakable crack of a rifle split the night. Shadows moved at the top of the ridge. Pursuers, closer now, closing in with calculated precision. Among them, Colton Briggs led the way, his silhouette unmistakable. Broad shoulders, a deliberate stride, a rifle held with practiced ease. The man's presence turned the night colder. He had been a ghost story in Ethan's world, rumored dead, but more dangerous in exile than he'd ever been in uniform. Desperation forced them onward. Claire led a zigzagging escape through the trees, boots slipping on hidden ice, breath tearing from her lungs. Ethan followed, guiding her when the way narrowed, shielding her with his body when the trees thinned. The kitten's keen cries rang out as a warning, helping them avoid the worst traps. An icy patch disguised by pine needles, a sudden drop into a ravine. It was as if the little animal, though weak and battered, refused to surrender its place in this fight. Their only hope was to reach the river, where the ice had not yet fully formed, and the current might mask their scent. But when they arrived at the bank, the river was a black, roiling snake, edged with unstable shelves of ice. The current hissed under the crust, threatening to pull anything into its frozen grip. Still, they had no choice. Pursuers moved above them now, voices echoing through the trees, beams of flashlights cutting erratic paths across the snow. Ethan tested the ice, feeling it flex beneath his weight. Claire hesitated, clutching her pack, eyes darting to the shadows on the ridge. Then a rifle cracked, a bullet striking a tree so close that bark exploded at her feet. Instinct took over. Ethan shoved Claire forward, shouting for her to keep low and run, then darted sideways, drawing attention away. The kitten pressed close to his chest. The world became a blur of panic. Claire skidded across the ice, nearly falling, her breath forming clouds that vanished into the storm. Ethan followed, barely daring to trust the creaking ice. The kitten yowled, a wild sound that seemed both terrified and defiant. Behind them, Colton Briggs shouted orders, his men fanning out in a practiced, merciless sweep. The ice groaned, splintered, and then Ethan's foot punched through, icy water biting his skin. He scrambled, pulling himself out with sheer will, the kitten clinging desperately to his jacket. Claire screamed for him, but he waved her on, determined to draw the danger his way. Briggs appeared at the edge of the canyon, gun raised, eyes locked on Ethan. For a breathless moment, it was a standoff. Ethan, half submerged in freezing water, the kitten pressed against his heart. Briggs, weapon steady, a silent predator about to strike. The snow swirled, the river roared, and every nerve in Ethan's body screamed for action, but surrender was never an option. The world narrowed to the frozen river, the blinding swirl of snow, and the echo of Briggs' boots cracking through the brittle crust overhead. Ethan's muscles burned, numbed by cold and adrenaline, but he fought to haul himself from the icy water. The kitten clung to his chest, fur plastered and wild eyes wide with animal fear, but alive. A tiny, trembling heart refusing to give up. Colton Briggs, weapon steady and steps deliberate, moved along the riverbank with all the patience of a man who believed himself invincible. Years ago, Ethan might have faced him as an ally. Tonight, he was an adversary with the eyes of a wolf and no mercy in his soul. The blizzard raged around them, muting sound, distorting distance, but Ethan knew Briggs wouldn't miss at this range. Claire had vanished into the darkness, somewhere upriver, hopefully far enough that the evidence she carried was out of reach for now. Ethan's mind raced. The river's surface was an unstable mosaic of black water and slabs of shifting ice. Above, snow-laden branches bent low, some nearly brushing the river. The whole scene a cruel parody of peace. Briggs stopped at the edge of a broken shelf, rifle raised, gaze fixed with icy certainty. In that instant, Ethan recognized a tactical opening, a memory from another life, buried deep, sparked by the glint of moonlight on fractured ice. His hands, shaking but sure, began working at the weak spot where his foot had broken through. Every movement had to be silent, measured, with Briggs only feet away and his attention unwavering. But the old soldier's tricks, learned on darker nights than this, came back to Ethan. He pressed down, shifting his weight, spreading his body to destabilize the fragile shelf beneath them. A sharp crack split the air. Briggs tensed, senses trained for ambush, but the sound of shifting ice was lost beneath the relentless howl of the wind. Ethan kept at it, eyes darting, heart thundering. Above, the kitten shifted, its claws digging into his jacket. Then, as if sensing the plan, it leapt from his arms in a sudden, desperate arc, landing atop a pile of snow-covered rocks just above Briggs's line of sight. For a heartbeat, even the storm seemed to freeze. Briggs's focus shifted, his eyes tracking the sudden blur of motion. An animal, not a man. But movement in the edge of vision always draws a predator's eye. That was the moment Ethan needed. With every ounce of strength, he forced his body down and sideways, sending spiderweb cracks racing across the surface beneath Briggs's feet. The veteran's intuition, sharpened by years of surviving the worst, guided his hands and feet as he drove the trap to completion. Briggs, realizing the danger a split second too late, sprang back, but the ice gave way with a thunderous groan. The river claimed him, swallowing his heavy form in a spray of freezing water. For a moment, Ethan caught his adversary's wild, furious eyes above the churning blackness. Then Briggs disappeared beneath the surface, rifle spinning away into the dark. The roar of water closed over the moment, erasing all traces except for the rippling hole in the ice. Ethan dragged himself free, muscles on fire, body shaking with the effort. The kitten, still perched on the rocks, let out a plaintive, victorious yowl that echoed through the trees. In that instant, the line between man and animal, soldier and survivor blurred. The instinct to protect, to fight for every breath, the only thing keeping either of them upright. Snow whipped through the canyon, stinging Ethan's skin. He staggered to his feet, boots skidding across the ice, and called softly for the kitten. It hesitated, ears pinned, then scrambled back into his arms. Its body was a shock of warmth against his chilled chest, the tremor in its limbs matching the quiver in his own. There was no time to savor the narrow escape. Distant voices rose along the ridgeline, Briggs' men searching, shouting into the storm. The river's current carried the sound away, but Ethan knew the danger had only lessened, not vanished. The real victory was in survival and the fragile hope that Claire had made it further upstream, out of reach. He pressed forward, every step an act of will. Blood trickled from a gash on his palm, staining the snow, but he barely noticed. The memory of Briggs sinking beneath the ice haunted him. No joy, only grim necessity. In war, every action left its mark, and tonight was no exception. They followed the riverbank until the storm began to lose its teeth, the snow falling softer, the wind dying to a sigh. The landscape transformed again. The world seemed bigger, emptier, every tree and hill loaded with the tension of what had just passed. Ethan slowed his pace, sheltering beneath a fallen pine, and took stock. The kitten, no longer trembling, stared up at him with a curious defiance, as if it knew, somehow, that together they had survived something impossible. For a while, Ethan allowed himself to believe in safety. The river's voice grew gentle, the forest around them settling into a watchful quiet. But he knew the road ahead was far from finished. The authorities needed Claire's evidence. Justice, real, lasting justice, depended on what happened next. As dawn hinted pink on the horizon, Ethan rose, clutching the kitten close. With every step, he carried not only a battered life, but the weight of a mission far greater than any he had ever faced. The real test of endurance and courage was yet to come. The world felt softer at dawn, yet Ethan's body ached with every heartbeat, battered by cold and exhaustion. The river's icy ordeal had left his limbs stiff and clumsy, muscles cramped beneath soaked layers, every breath rasping like broken glass in his chest. But the kitten pressed against him, a living ember in the aftermath of chaos, and that small, fragile presence anchored him to the world, giving purpose to pain. He stumbled through the thinning snow, guided more by instinct than reason, following the faint trail Claire had left. Footprints half filled by drifting powder, an occasional thread from her jacket caught on low branches. His vision blurred at the edges, fatigue threatening to pull him under. But the promise he'd made, to see this through, to protect what mattered, kept him upright. They pressed on through the pine forest, the trees crowding overhead like silent witnesses. Ethan's thoughts scattered, looping through fractured memories, the shriek of bullets, the river's black maw swallowing Briggs, the kitten's fearless leap, Claire's silhouette vanishing into the blizzard. Everything narrowed to the present, one foot in front of the other, the quick pulse of a tiny heart under his hand. The sun finally crested the eastern ridge, painting the world gold and silver. Ethan saw a small cabin up ahead, a forgotten outpost from an old ranger station. Smoke curled faintly from its chimney. He pushed onward, each step a battle, vision tunneling until the door opened and Claire's face appeared, wild-eyed and desperate, her relief pouring out in a shuddering breath. Inside, the warmth was overwhelming. Claire wrapped Ethan in a thermal blanket, her hands gentle but efficient, checking him for frostbite and injuries. She worked in silence, focus sharp, her mind already racing through the next steps. The evidence, the capsule and chip, remained secure in her pack, now triple-wrapped and hidden beneath the floorboards. For a brief, impossible moment, safety felt real. The kitten, fur still damp and matted, curled up near the stove, its breathing deepening with the comfort of heat. Claire bandaged Ethan's hands and checked his pulse, her expression revealing the toll of the night's ordeal. Both of them bore the scars of survival, cuts and bruises, haunted eyes, the lingering ache of fear that never quite faded. But peace was fragile. By midday, distant sounds filtered through the trees, snowmobiles, raised voices, the sharp crack of an engine backfiring. The hunt was not over. Claire stood by the window, watching shadows flicker across the snow, nerves taut as piano wire. She knew what was at stake. The truth hidden in the capsule was dangerous enough to make good people disappear, to send killers into the wilderness without hesitation. Ethan forced himself up, stubbornness fueling motion. He dressed in dry layers, the pain in his chest now a constant drumbeat, warning of limits he could not afford to honor. He helped Claire gather their few supplies, and together they devised a plan. Claire would take the evidence the last mile. Her knowledge of the woods and her contacts at the federal courthouse gave her a slim chance to evade the men who hunted them. Ethan, weaker now but still determined, would stay behind with the kitten, serving as decoy and guardian both. Their goodbye was hurried, necessity overriding emotion. Claire slipped out the back, melting into the trees, leaving Ethan alone with the wildcat, silence pressing in like a second winter. Time slowed. Every minute stretched taut, the waiting almost unbearable. Ethan nursed the kitten, whispering words he couldn't remember learning, brushing tangles from its fur, drawing strength from its stubborn will to survive. When the first of Briggs's men appeared at the edge of the clearing, guns raised, eyes cold and empty, Ethan stood in the doorway, body a wall between danger and innocence. The standoff was brief. Briggs's men, seeing their quarry battered and alone, advanced cautiously, unwilling to risk their prize to violence. Ethan stalled, drawing their attention with stories, misdirections, a bluff born from desperation and a lifetime spent in the crosshairs. In the chaos, the kitten slipped from his arms, darting under the porch and out of sight, a streak of gold vanishing into the pines. The men searched, overturning furniture and barking orders, but found nothing. Frustration simmered. Ethan, battered and beaten, endured their blows without protest, his mind fixed on the hope that Claire had made it through, that the evidence was beyond their reach. Eventually, with no sign of the kitten and no evidence to claim, the men retreated, melting into the forest, their threat receding with the sound of engines vanishing into the distance. When silence finally returned, Ethan collapsed to his knees, the cost of survival etched in every line of his face. The kitten did not return. Dawn melted into day, and the cabin felt emptier than ever. As the hours passed, news trickled in. The authorities had been alerted, the evidence delivered. The scandal broke across the airwaves, a wildfire of revelation that swept through towns and cities, names and faces exposed for the world to see. Ethan watched from his cabin, numb with exhaustion and relief. The kitten's absence, a sharp ache beneath his ribs. He had saved his country, but lost the small, wild companion who had trusted him against all odds. The price paid, he realized, was not just wounds and scars, but the letting go of something precious, a lesson etched deeper than any victory. Weeks passed, and Montana settled back into its late winter quiet. The storm that had nearly buried Ethan was just another memory now, melting slowly from the ridgelines and dripping off the eaves of Walker's Diner in clear, cold beads. The world outside seemed untouched by the drama that had spun through Ethan's life like a hurricane. Trucks rumbled by on the highway, regulars lingered over bottomless mugs of coffee, and old Tom at the counter still complained about the weather, never knowing how close their quiet town had come to the shadow of something dark and violent. Inside, Ethan moved with a new deliberateness, shoulders still stiff from old injuries and the cold that wouldn't quite leave his bones. The days passed in a steady rhythm, open at 6, eggs frying on the griddle, laughter mingling with the hiss of coffee machines. But beneath the surface, Ethan carried the weight of what had happened. The chase through snow and ice, the fear clawing at his insides, and the memory of a kitten's heartbeat beneath his hand. The townsfolk talked in hushed tones, stories growing and twisting with every telling. Sometimes Ethan caught a phrase, "the veteran and the bobcat cub," spoken with a strange kind of awe. No one knew the details, only that something had happened. Something worth whispering about. Something wild and extraordinary. A few locals came by more often than before, their eyes curious but their words cautious, as if afraid that asking the wrong question might chase away the magic. Becky, the waitress, sometimes paused in the middle of her shift and glanced out the frosted windows toward the tree line, as if she expected to see a flash of gold or the glint of wild eyes. Ethan kept his own counsel, smiling politely and steering the conversations back to the weather or the cost of flour. Yet inside, every sound outside the diner, a snap of a twig, a sudden gust, sent a ripple of old fear through him. He found himself watching the edge of the woods at dusk, scanning for any sign of movement. Part of him still hoped, foolishly, for the return of the kitten, though he knew how wild things were. Sometimes, the ones you save have to leave before they can truly be free. At night, Ethan sat on the porch after the last customer had gone, a cup of strong coffee cradled in his hands. He listened to the quiet, the deep, unbroken quiet that only Montana can offer, broken only by the faint calls of owls and the distant sigh of wind across snow. It was in those hours that the lessons of the past weeks settled deepest in him. He thought about all he'd lost and all he'd gained. There was no hero's welcome waiting for him, no medal or parade, just the slow, steady work of recovery, both of body and spirit. The wounds on his hands faded first, then the bruises on his ribs. But the ache in his chest, the space left by the wild companion who had shared his burden and his journey, lingered longest. In that ache, though, Ethan found something unexpected, a quiet pride, the kind that grows from choosing to protect what is fragile, even when it means risking everything. He remembered the kitten's refusal to cower, the fierce spark in its wild eyes. Trust, he realized, wasn't about taming or owning. It was about offering safety and expecting nothing in return, about stepping up, even when the world offered no guarantees. One evening, as the sun burned gold over the snow-capped peaks, Ethan overheard a group of teenagers speculating about the story. It wasn't strength that mattered, one of them said, repeating what Ethan himself had once whispered to the kitten. It was trust, and protecting something weaker than yourself, no matter the cost. The words echoed, simple and true, and Ethan felt a warmth bloom in his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. He watched as the community slowly took the lesson to heart. Neighbors checked on one another more often. An old woman who used to shoo stray cats now left bowls of milk on her porch. Children dared each other to spot bobcat tracks in the snow, turning fear into fascination. It was as if the ordeal had stitched something new into the town's fabric, a memory of courage and quiet kindness, a reminder that even the smallest life could change the course of many. On the anniversary of the storm, Ethan walked to the edge of the forest at dusk. He stood among the pines, letting the silence wash over him, searching the shadowed ridge for any sign, a shape, a flicker, a hope. The wind stirred, and for a heartbeat, he imagined he saw a slender, tawny form slip between the trees, pausing to look back before vanishing into the wild. He didn't call out. He simply watched, heart full, and nodded once to the fading light. Back at the diner, as darkness settled and the neon sign flickered to life, Ethan understood what had changed. He was still the same man, scarred, tired, grounded in routine. But beneath all that, he was something more. A guardian, a survivor, and, above all, a believer in the unseen power of trust. The world had moved on, as it always does, but Ethan Walker would never forget. Some lessons lived on, not as stories, but as silent vows, kept and honored no matter the cost. The season changed slowly, as it always does in Montana. The last ice melted from the edges of the streams, and early shoots of grass pressed up through the lingering snow. Life at the diner returned to its familiar, comforting routine, though beneath the surface, something subtle had shifted, not just in Ethan, but in the whole community. The story of the veteran and the wild kitten had spread, growing with each telling, woven into the fabric of small-town memory. On one particularly clear evening, Ethan finished wiping down the last table and set the chairs up for morning. The bell above the door jingled softly as he locked up, the world outside painted in deep purples and golds. He stepped onto the porch and let the cool air settle into his lungs. The sun was sinking behind the mountains, gilding every ridge with fire. For a moment, Ethan simply stood there, letting the silence wrap around him, more peaceful than it had been in years. He thought of all that had changed. He still bore the aches of winter's ordeal, an ache in his side when he worked too long, the occasional startle at sudden noise. But the worst wounds were healing. The memory of the kitten lingered, less sharp now, folded into the softer edges of gratitude and wonder. He realized he didn't look for it every day anymore, though each time he passed the tree line, he felt the old, quiet hope flicker in his chest. The town, too, bore the marks of transformation. folks took more notice of the wild, and not just out of fear. The local school hosted talks about protecting wildlife. Neighbors banded together to mend fences, clear trash from the woods, and keep an eye on the stray cats that wandered through. Even old Tom had stopped grumbling about pests, leaving scraps out near the trash where foxes and occasionally a braver bobcat might visit. The story of Ethan and the kitten had grown into legend, a reminder of what it meant to care, to risk, to reach out beyond your own troubles. As dusk deepened, Ethan wandered behind the diner, boots crunching softly over patches of ice and thawing earth. He scanned the distant ridgeline, not really expecting to see anything, but welcoming the quiet anyway. It had become a kind of ritual, these evening walks, a way to pay respect to the silent wildness that bordered his world. One night, just as the first stars appeared, he saw a shape crest the snowy ridge, small, slender, moving with a grace that could only belong to something wild. For a heartbeat, the figure paused at the top, silhouetted against the dying light. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The animal stood perfectly still, alert, beautiful, with the suggestion of a slight limp in its step. The wind shifted, carrying the faintest cry, a sound halfway between greeting and farewell. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the kitten slipped away into the trees, leaving Ethan with nothing but memory and wonder. He didn't chase or call. He only smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over him, as if the world had returned something lost, not in body but in spirit. Later that week, as Ethan poured coffee for the morning crowd, a little girl tugged at his apron and asked if the story was true, if he really had saved a bobcat kitten, if wild things could trust people, if small acts of bravery mattered. He knelt beside her, meeting her curious eyes, and found himself telling the story, not as a tale of danger and loss, but as a lesson in courage and care. He told her how sometimes the smallest lives can carry the greatest weight, how trust is built slowly, through kindness and patience, how the choice to protect something fragile can change the course of a life, or even a town. The girl listened, wide-eyed, before running off to tell her friends, and Ethan watched as the story rippled out, touching lives he might never know. That evening, as sunset set the sky ablaze, Ethan wrote a note and taped it to the diner's notice board. Sometimes, the smallest lives carry the greatest weight. Have you ever risked everything for something fragile? Share your story in the comments. He signed it with just his first name and left space below, an invitation to anyone who passed through his world. Over the weeks, people added their own words. Tales of stray dogs rescued from highways, of neighbors helping neighbors in snowstorms, of kindnesses given without hope of reward. The board filled, a testament to the quiet heroism of ordinary lives. Standing outside the diner one last time, Ethan scanned the snowy ridge. For an instant, he thought I saw a familiar silhouette, slender, wild, impossibly brave, before it vanished into the blue shadows. Maybe it was real. Maybe it was only hope. But it was enough. Ethan understood then that some stories never truly end. They echo through lives, through communities, shaping the world in ways no one expects. His story, with all its risk, heartache, and wonder, had become part of the place he called home. And in the hush that followed, Ethan Walker, veteran, survivor, protector, knew he would never look at the wild quite the same way again.